Great. Before we begin, just want to mention that we have closed captioning enabled for anyone who would like to use that. Good evening. My name is Irene Cheng. I'm a professor of architecture here at the California College of the Arts. I am subbing in for our dean, Keith Crumwoody, who will be joining shortly. So thank you all for joining us tonight for the Materialities of Architectural Discourse, a conversation with a group of very talented voices in contemporary criticism: Jess Myers, Kate Wagner, and Cruz Garcia, and Nathalie Frankowski. Tonight's event has been organized by myself and James Graham as co-directors of CCA's History Theory Experiments Lab. And this is the 6th event of our fall 2021 architecture lecture series. At CCA, we always start our lectures with a land acknowledgement. We understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. CCA campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who've continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. Before we get started, I'd also like to mention the next and last event in our lecture series. Next Wednesday, November 17th at 5 p.m., Kelly Baer and Christy Ballier, principals of Baer Ballier, will deliver their lecture Core Work. And you can find the full fall lecture series schedule, along with stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. And now I'll pass the screen over to my colleague, James Graham.
Hey everyone, welcome. Super excited to be here with you all tonight. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Keith, for giving us this space on the calendar. Thank you, Sarah, as always, for making these things happen. Thank you to Carlos Medellin, our fantastic TA, who put together a really lively poster for this event. So I'm going to quickly share some slides here. Okay. So we're thinking of this event tonight in some ways less as a formal panel and more like a sort of open classroom, in the sense that this is of course part of the lecture series, but it's also part of our class in architectural theory here at the California College of the Arts. It's a course that brings together the grad and undergrad populations. And what we're aiming for with this course is not to sort of reproduce a kind of anthology style history of texts about architecture, but to really think instead about the ways that architectural ideas engage with the world and enter into practice. And Irene and I, as co-hosts, think that the folks who we've assembled here this evening are all really fantastic folks to do that sort of thinking with. And so I'm going to really quickly kick things off by sort of basically explaining what we mean by the title, this idea about materialities of architectural discourse. So, approaching architectural discourse through the lens of media theory means thinking about the ways that the sort of tools of discourse help to frame the kind of horizons of architectural thought. Or as Marshall McLuhan, of course, famously put it, the idea that the medium is the message. Architectural theory has sort of typically been understood as a history of print discourse from the sort of millennia-long survival of Vitruvius at the hands of these sort of monks copying out manuscripts, for example, or in the form of things like the woodcuts of the Yingxiao Faxi of the 12th century. The advent of the printing press, the narrative goes, is part of what really sort of cements the idea that architectural ideas might be disseminated not just through buildings, but really through books, establishing theory in its kind of written forms as a sort of necessary complement of architectural practice, or maybe even the sort of driver of architectural practice. And, you know, with these images, the sort of kind of musty sort of fragility of these kind of old pages that I'm showing here, I think it sort of points to some of the questions that we're trying to raise around materiality, the sort of the frictions, the limits, the difficulties, the capacities, the durabilities of different forms of communication and different forms of documenting architectural thought. So the world of print discourse was often about establishing rules, principles, guidelines for future practice. In other moments, it was about a sort of epistemic conquest, if you will, or the kind of participation of architectural theory and history in the sort of global knowledge colonization. But throughout it all, the changing tools produced different possibilities for how architectural ideas would be conveyed. The rise of things like lithography, bringing kind of new scale to the spread of printed pages, or photolithography, allowing the sort of the printing of photographs, but also a kind of new enmeshment of text and image, something that I think some of the folks speaking about today are practicing in their own particular ways. The 20th century increasingly saw these forms of media harnessed to political ends, raising questions about the role of space and politics within architectural theory and architectural discourse. And likewise, as the sort of technologies of print became increasingly lighter and increasingly more accessible, here you see a sort of the canonical print methods of the 1960s, the risograph on the left or the Xerox on the right. These things likewise sort of challenged architectural theory, moving theory away from the sort of authoritative formality of things like printed treatises, for example, or for that matter, the advent of consumer-grade televisual media, seen here in something like Ant Farm's Media Van, which raises their own questions about the circulation of architectural thought. And here we start drawing closer, I think, to some of the kind of topics that will be addressed today. What did the tools of digital media mean for architectural theory? The kind of new modes of imaging and distribution, especially, that they implied for architectural ideas. And for that matter, what does the sort of continuing embrace of print discourse, particularly in its activist forms, mean for our socially mediated present? So these are not necessarily the questions that our guests tonight are going to be talking about, not at all. In fact, they might be talking about things totally far afield from this sort of brief history of print that I've offered. We've invited them here to share about their own practices and for us to have a sort of workshop style discussion about that. But I offer this sort of lightning fast tour mostly to provoke our audience so that we can all sort of think together about what it means to step outside of our own tools, to kind of look at their materiality and in some way ask what it means to share ideas through the media that we're sharing them through, even Zoom, for example. And above all, to sort of ask how the sort of array of media that are available to us have their own affordances, possibilities, constraints in the forms of engaged practice that I think we're all here seeking to cultivate. And so to that end, we're delighted to be joined by a really stellar group of folks to tell us about their work and ask some of these questions with us. So now I'll do some quick introductions. First, we will be hearing from Jess Myers. Jess is a podcaster, a writer, and an editor focusing on urban planning and architecture. And her podcast, Here There Be Dragons, explores the intersection of identity politics and security policy in public spaces. She's now an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of the Arts, Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. Then after that, we will hear from Why Architecture Think Tank, founded by Cruz, Garcia, and Nathalie Frankowski. They're the authors of Narrative Architecture, a Kinnico Manifesto, as well as the recent Manual of Anti-Racist Architectural Education, a PDF that was certainly making the rounds recently. And they're the creators of Loud Readers, an open pedagogical platform, and free trade school that engages with architectural education as a form of mutual aid and critical solidarity. They're now teaching at Iowa State. And then finally, we will hear from Kate Wagner, an architecture critic and the creator of the much beloved blog McMansion Hell, which you've probably encountered. She's written for Curbed, 99% Invisible, The Atlantic, Architectural Digest, many other places. Her recent essay on corona grifting was one that was certainly making the rounds here during the pandemic. And I think it's fair to say that Kate is single-handedly getting architecture Twitter invested in professional cycling. So the format for the evening, we're going to plunge straight into a series of 8 to 10-minute presentations, after which Irene and I will offer a few questions, and then we'll open the floor. Everyone's encouraged to participate. You'll probably see the theory students popping into the chat with thoughts, responses, questions of their own. We'd encourage everyone to do the same. And without further delay, let's get started. And I will pass the Zoom to Jess Myers.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to start sharing screen. I'm actually going to time myself because that's helpful for me to that 10 minutes. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. Did that work? Great. So my name is Jess Myers, and as James already introduced, my podcast, Here There Be Dragons, is a show about basically security narratives. And what are security narratives? Are the stories that we tell ourselves and others about how space is safe or unsafe. So I myself got really interested in this on a critical level after the 2015 shootings in Paris. So that was a city that I've spent a lot of time in, and the way that it was narrativized, and then the opportunities that those security narratives presented for space. For example, if you have seen Leopold Lambert, who's the editor of The Funambulists, his research about the state of emergency policy in Paris, essentially completely redevelops the landscape of public and private space for people who are suspected of being essentially potential terrorists or perpetrators of shootings. But if we think about something more recent as an example, if you look at the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, you can also see that as a trial of public space and who gets to negotiate public space in what way. So for example, if it is ruled to be self-defense, then we will have a very different understanding of automatic weapons in public space, and who gets to access them and who gets to feel protected by them versus who gets to feel victimized or threatened by them. And in the same way, it will drastically change the way that protest happens in public space in the United States. So to be able to read security narratives as essentially the tent poles of how people are able to move through public space and how people think of themselves as a part of or separate from urban spaces. So I actually, often struggle to find images, obviously, because I think everyone thinks of architecture as sort of a visual medium, and working in a podcast, there are only so many waveforms you can show people before that becomes old. So I'm hoping that these prove a helpful place to rest your eyes for the moment. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the show and how it comes together and kind of the thinking behind it. So Here There Be Dragons really looks at resident experiences and the way that residents of cities talk about their own securities or build their own security narratives as essentially post-occupancy studies of policy and urban design. So the idea was to kind of combine sort of social scientists, research methodologies from the social sciences by doing a sample of interviews on certain cities, talking specifically about security narratives. And then instead of presetting what the episodes would be about, what we do instead is we transcribe and code all the interviews, essentially looking for what the common phrases or concepts or ideas are that cut across resident interviews. And then those become the themes of each episode, which is why it takes us basically 3 years to produce a miniseries. So we started with New York as kind of this pilot idea, and then that was just me on my own prior to having any real sound experience at all, which you can definitely hear in that season. But at the same time, I like to leave that out there because you can see how with expertise and also crucially funding, the sound can get better and better. So we started with New York, and then we moved to Paris right after the 2015 shootings, and then we moved into Stockholm, which also had a number of public attacks, but also of public security policies that really shifted how people comfortably move through urban space. So here we're looking at my studio in Stockholm, or part of my studio in Stockholm. And on the wall, you see a number of maps. So essentially, while we're interviewing people, because often everybody, absolutely everybody has a security narrative of how they move through space. Even when people say, you know, I'm not afraid of anything, I'll just, you know, I can walk through Times Square naked at 3 a.m. and I don't care. That's also a security narrative. It gives you certain assumptions about what makes you feel safe and who you expect to protect you in space. So essentially what we do to get people started talking through these narratives that you have but are so commonplace to you that it's often surprising to be asked about them, is to do a mapping exercise where they're sort of drawing on these maps that I create of these cities, essentially where they feel safe, where they feel unsafe, and sort of common routes that they take through the city. So when you think about usually mapping in architecture, it's the situationists that come to mind. But at the same time, the situationists really focus on individual experience and don't necessarily tie them back to questions of policy, questions of spatial design. It sort of stays in the world of phenomenology. So we really wanted to take that a little bit farther. So that meant that looking further afield for sort of mapping influences that could help the way that we talk about the show. So a couple of these are Cecilia Mecki, who's a Black British filmmaker, her show, her series, Strolling, where essentially she was just following Black Europeans through their cities and talking to them about their experiences in their neighborhoods. And then a novel by Juan Gabriel Vasquez, The Sound of Things Falling, that's really about rebuilding. So residents of Bogota in the post-Escobar period in Colombia, rebuilding a relationship to their city after like a very violent period. And then lastly is the mapping journey by Bukhra Khalili, who is really focusing on stories of migrants moving across the Mediterranean Ocean, but not in the same sort of very sensationalist way that you might see in European news, but rather just a hand tracing a trail saying, you know, this is where I paid the smuggler, this is where we got on the raft, this is where I got deported, this is how I came back, this is where I tried again, just sort of matter-of-factly. So these were the references that we took in for the first season. And then for the second season, as we were also dealing with translation with the interviews that we conducted in French, we also took in some help from Trinity Minha, who's a Vietnamese American filmmaker and essayist, who really in her work claims the fact that the translation is also an editorial act, and ways of playing with translation in a way that recognizes that, but also allows you to do tricky things. Like in the third season, the Stockholm season, we are always trying to make it interesting for people who are from the city, but also introduce the city to people who may be a bit unaware. So in the audio, what we'll do is things like pairing someone whose interview was in Swedish with someone whose interview was in English, and then pinging them back and forth so that it sounds, if you only speak one of those languages, that the one is describing what the other is saying. But if you speak both of the languages, it sounds like a conversation between them. So just like little Easter eggs like that. And then for a more theoretical underpinning, we really turn to, or especially I really turn to both Edward Said, which is, he's more known obviously for Orientalism, but really taking a page out actually out of cultural and imperialism. And then also from Zadie Smith's critical writing, her critical essays, although she's very well known for her essays, the critical pieces really allow you to see how to piece together culture from quote unquote like high and low scale to create some kind of sort of cultural critique through line, just as Said is also doing in cultural imperialism. Is, you know, no one is asking an Egyptian-born Palestinian sort of classic musician slash, you know, comparative literature major to give them, you know, the reason why Ireland is like the most relevant, longstanding, you know, colonial standoff through the poetry of Yeats. But he does it anyway, and the way that he's tying that together is really how we try to tie together an individual experience from a city resident with the sort of policy and urban planning decisions that are also sort of influencing that experience that might not be totally legible to one resident, but when you start stacking them all together, you can really see that arc. And then lastly, just showing a bit of an example of episodes from the 3rd season. And then also we run a mini series through our Patreon where we focus on sort of one voice of stories that are relevant, but we can't really fit into a show. Like we talked to urban marine biologist in Stockholm who had a very long digression about fish traffic in cities that is delightful, but didn't fit in the show. So we wanted to still have that piece in. But essentially all of this flows from those conversations. We don't sort of preset any ideas, and that's how these seasons and these sort of mini bites of the interviews take shape. So I'm gonna end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jess. Let's move straight on to Cruz and Nathalie.
Let me time it. Yeah, I just wanted to say that thanks a lot for the invitation, because I feel like when we are doing this type of thing, it's like it's almost like cheating into education, where we are really learning from everybody that is speaking. So it's really like it's great to be a part of these events. And I think there's so many, like, of course, because you curated it, but there's many crossing points with what we're saying. So because it's only 10 minutes, I'm gonna speak because I am really a fast talker, and after Nathalie's gonna join in the discussion, and I'm gonna flip to some, like, a ton of images, and they relate to this question of the postcolonial outrider. We are Way Architecture think tank, and going with the situation is this a map of the first 13 years of our career. So we are kind of the children of the crisis in a way. Puerto Rican, French, met in Belgium, live in the Netherlands, 7 years in China, been in the US teaching for like some years now, I forgot how many. We founded our studio, 40th year anniversary of civil rights movement, Stonewall, streets of Paris, right? So there's many crossing points in this sort of idea of change and crisis. We are theorists in, I feel, in the conventional sense, in the way that, and also we work with media and also in the conventional sense. So a lot of work through exhibition and publications. There are some of the books that we have published, from DIY at the beginning to now more like conventional or collaborative publications, some of them free online, some of them with actual publishers. So there's a mixture. I also come from the world oldest colony, and this is really important to understand. What does the post-colonial means to a person that has never lived after the colony? So it's like we try to understand how the model of the brutality that we experience in the Caribbean and in the colonies could be a lens to understand the cruelty that is happening around the world. And those are the things that are being addressed through the pandemic, through the asymmetric effects, through the people that are really leading us through a path of justice and emancipation. You know, I love this t-shirt by the feminist collective in construction in Puerto Rico that reads anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American, all the indigenous struggles. All these parts are really important to our sort of understanding of what does it mean, the post-colonial, when the regimes of brutality that are so present in the tropics, in the colonies, become the norm everywhere else. So what's the imagination that can challenge that settler colonial white state, white supremacy state, right? As images like this portray, but also how they also manifest in many other platforms, right? From obvious white supremacist movements to things that are perhaps more subtle, like platforms of education, right? Like our pedagogical system, you know, the heritage of modernism, but the Bauhaus, the experts, right, that mostly come from these Eurocentric places. They want to make a new European Bauhaus because the old Bauhaus was not European enough, apparently. So they like understanding what is the legacy of an education system that is based out of a sort of segregation among genders, right? The construction of gender and white supremacy, as is obvious in the Bauhaus and many other schools. And we're interested in looking at other models of education, you know, like the People's Art School in Vitebsk, where children and adults, women and men were working together, and particularly in Puerto Rico, where the tobacco workers who were denied any means of formal education would pick one of their own that knew how to read for them during the entire workday. People like Luisa Capetillo, feminist anarchist, syndico-anarchist, utopian author, would read Kropotkin, Marx, Engels, Bakunin, and she would also write fiction works where workers would rob banks and live happily ever after in the countryside. So we borrowed that idea, and during a series of events that we call post-novis, that is that post-colonial novis, we started working with students and collaborators across disciplines in exhibitions and a sort of alternative pedagogical model that developed a syllabus, a series of publications, and that later on, through talks and public events, took another form when COVID hit, right? And we could use somehow, in the spirit of Fred Moten in the Undercommons, when he talks about stealing from the university, using Zoom and all the platforms of social media that were available in this, through the large infrastructure of the university. And we created a free online platform, a Loud Reader platform, right? It's called Loud Reader's Trade School. And through that platform, we have, you know, we made open calls. There was like free of course, of cost, and tried to use our networks of solidarity from all around the world to invite speakers and thinkers, poets, philosophers, working, you know, at the intersection of race, gender, aesthetics, you name it, right? Like Leopold Lambert, Ilse Wolf joining from Cape Town, people joining from China, and run these sessions and workshops that are online, free, available, and use that as an opportunity also to question publishing platforms, to question the construction of curricula. These are some of the events that we had through the year. Also, it allows us to reframe and recenter our actual main epistemological axis, right? Decentering everything from the Eurocentric point of view, and bringing all the thinkers that all these thinkers are actually considering, have been considering since the beginning of their practice. This allowed us also to engage in actual acts of loud reading in the streets during protests. So it's not only something that happens through the academic lens, and engage with actual activists, right? Where we use our teaching platforms in universities to bring some of these people, sometimes from design and architecture, but also sometimes from actual activism in the streets, right? Like in the case of CCA in Pittsburgh. This also allowed us to open a platform for publishing that doesn't rely on the usual means. And we published an anti-racist architecture manifesto initially, and later on a manual of anti-racist architecture education. And it was like downloaded 20,000 times or something like that in the first 2 weeks, right? And people are using it with many sort of syllabus, curriculums and syllabus around the world. And the manual engages with these questions, right? That right now most of the words we're using, right, are illegal here in Iowa and in many other states with all these laws that have been passed, and which puts this document in a really, I think, in a really important historical moment. And Loud Readers have allowed us somehow to keep on expanding that network, right? These are some of the things that have been made illegal here in Iowa, just to give you, or in Texas and in Iowa, some of the words that people are kind of considering banning forever, including educational justice or things like equity or land acknowledgement, right? So you also kind of broke the law when you started the conversation today. So, and we have seen, you know, some of the downfalls of the ridiculousness of academia if nobody's following what the Alejandro Saera Polo did in his performance of auto implosion, like denouncing the woke university and so on. So what we're looking forward is how to keep on working on these tools, and these platforms have allowed us to develop a series of strategies, of images, of discourses, and also ways to engage. You know, these are some of the diagrams we created for some of those publications that deal with tuition fees and so on, as well as other collaborative projects, including plays that we have done with people across disciplines, but also with students from all around the world working together, and a series of performances and events, as well as a series of are some of the works that have been produced during some of the projects that have been born out of Loud Readers, as well as a series of publications. These are an amazing mural of a sort of post-colonial mural done by students from 3 land-grant universities across the United States, from Virginia Tech, University of Illinois, and UC Berkeley. I think it's a really fantastic also opportunity to that Loud Readers have brought us to expand networks of solidarity, but also of education and collaboration beyond the constraints of what academia proposes usually, right? Like when you're not really responding to one or another institution, also allowed us to invite many other kind of Loud Readers from all around the world that are not necessarily architects, in the case of filmmakers and poets, to create also projects, including exhibitions like this one we opened in Iowa State, and most recently our book, The Planetary Wretched, a post-colonial narrative architecture poetry book it got to our hands yesterday, and we're planning to release it in the spring in 2022. That is also a collaborative editorial experiment born out of Loud Readers, co-edited with students from Illinois, and with contributions from students from land-grant universities, and many of the Loud Readers that have been part of the many sessions, you know, including poets that are dealing with trans critique of Marxism, or with sort of Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, xenofuturism, and so on. And that's pretty much it. We just done 9 minutes 20 seconds, so hopefully with that was enough.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Cruz and Nathalie, for donating your 40 seconds back to the conversation at the end. We'll make good use of it. And finally, Kate, take it away.
Okay, I kind of feel like an asshole for, like, after coming off of 2 extremely impressive critical projects, to talk about a blog about ugly houses, but I'm going to do it anyway. And about platforms specifically. So in a lecture about architectural discourse, it is wise to assume that I have been brought here to talk about being an architecture critic on the internet, of which I am a native. Having the power to completely dismantle the institutions of old, the internet has radically changed the landscape of who is or who can be considered an authority, who is given legitimacy. In some ways, this can be seen as a shift towards greater opportunities to be heard, unstifled by the heady days of climbing one's way up within various institutions. However, virality has a dark side too. I think often of an article written last year in the Columbia Journalism Review about the liberal Trump-era political commentator Seth Abramson, who was/is well known for his sprawling, heavily conspiratorial threads on Twitter, which he has dubbed, quote, meta-journalism. Abramson, a public defender, cum poet, cum journalist, who started out his career writing reviews of MFA programs during the blogging era, went viral in 2017 for a tweet criticizing Kellyanne Conway, and quickly posted his way into being a columnist at Newsweek and a frequent guest on cable news. Yet, As Liz Lenz writes, Abramson's meta-journalism may not actually be journalism. It's just him sitting at home, tweeting out stories he stacked together like a house of cards without vetting them for accuracy, end quote. The picture she paints is a dark one of a neurotic man unable to reconcile the reverence, or rather lack of scrutiny, one gets from self-publishing and internet clout with the fact-checked institutional world of capital J journalism. She succinctly describes the situation as thus, quote, in some ways, virality has enabled marginalized voices to be heard, but an ecosystem ruled by likes and retweets is one in which nothing really has to be true, everything is entirely permissible, and notoriety confers legitimacy. Arguably, if one felt particularly antagonistic towards me, one could say the same about my own career. Architecturally speaking, I'm self-taught, and I feel that this is very important to point out. It's something I used to be ashamed of, but have now embraced. Yet this is a part of the reason why, for me, going viral, which was an accident, I must add, and becoming notable did not give me a personal sense of legitimacy. As for a professional sense of legitimacy, I decided it was worth it, despite viral fame, to do that legwork myself. And over the course of the last 6 years, I freelanced on the side, writing for a number of publications, some smaller, like the 99% of Invisible blog and Atlas Obscura, then in places like Curves, which were more notable, but still confined to certain parts of the internet pertaining to architecture and design. Then I moved on to bigger outlets like The Atlantic and The Baffler inch by inch, year by year. However, it was only after I became architecture critic at the New Republic in 2019 that I became truly, quote, legitimated as an architecture critic by the institutions I had sidestepped through my unconventional career route, despite the fact that I had called myself and had been referred to by others as an architecture critic since as early as 2017. I have since left that position after the magazine's editorial change, a common fate for us unsalaried writers. This is all to make the point, I swear there's a point in talking about myself, that despite the so-called democratizing force of the internet in fields such as architecture, it is still institutions, be they magazines or universities, that hold the keys to authority and therefore theoretically to discourse. I say this because I do not want to give the impression that things are more egalitarian than they actually are, and because paradoxically, the blog, which gave me my voice to begin with, now sometimes seems like a detraction from the legitimacy I've gained through these other projects. This is difficult to reconcile, but I think it's important to be honest about these struggles, especially with students. Let's return, however, to the internet. All platforms and all discourses, however, are transitional. McMansion Hell does not exist in a vacuum. Its earliest precedents can be found during the heyday of postmodernism, including the humorous caption illustrations in Venturi and Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas, and the 1973 book Daydream Houses of Los Angeles by the architectural critic and theorist Charles Jenks, which featured delightful Stephen Shore-esque snapshots of funky houses in Los Angeles with pithy captions underneath calling them, quote, Liberace chic or, quote, topiary fascist. Inspiration for the tone and format of McMansion Hell owes a lot to mid-2000s internet media, such as blogs like Hyperbole and a Half, webcomics, specifically A Softer World, and websites like crack.com. More recent precedents on the internet include the blogs Ugly Belgian Houses and Terrible Real Estate Photos, which were both started in the early 2010s, and both projects followed the typical blog-to-book pipeline that defined that era. Because McMansion Hell operates within the confines of Tumblr, a microblogging platform, you're gonna hear that word a lot, with social media characteristics, and is funded by Patreon, the crowdfunding site, and is therefore helplessly dependent, here we get into actual materialities, on not one, but two volatile and profit-oriented tech companies, it can be seen as a kind of transitional media that succeeds by means of being native to the streamlined social media infrastructure that had already been established by the time 2016 rolled around, while adapting to a new monetization platforms that now, like inline ads before them, if you remember those, it's becoming obsolete themselves as the profit side of the internet starts to shift alarmingly quickly and very unfortunately for the planet towards cryptocurrency. Hence, sadly, McMansion Hell is also of its time, and the projects that have followed are entirely suited to and are fully enveloped within new platforms and structures of social media, to the point where they are almost entirely image or video driven with little to no writing, short or long form involved. If McMansion Hell is to be seen as some kind of case study for new discourses, which it often is in curricula that it is presented in, then so too should its successors. And these include one-liner based themed Twitter accounts, again, for better or for worse, such as Best of Zillow, Instagram accounts such as Dank Lloyd Wright, which interestingly, despite its popularity, is even more specified to the more niche practices of architecture and includes extremely funny jokes about architectural theory, and a variety of TikTok accounts, the most interesting of which is 432 Park Avenue Hate Page, which is devoted to the intense critical evisceration of Raphael Vignelli's Super Tall in New York City. This last iteration is perhaps the closest analog to McMansion Hell in that it is an intense, distinctly critical project that capitalizes on the use of a new generation of social media that is frankly beyond my comprehension, thus putting me distinctly within, quote, yesterday's generation. However, the written nature of my blog and its secondary educational purpose is what lent itself to scaling up into a career as a critic. Returning to a point I made earlier, the written territory holds firm in some ways against new media, but critically not, as in the Rolling Stones Bored Ape NFT collaboration shows, against new forms of profit making, no matter how decentralized and democratic they purport and only purport to be. Still, broadly speaking, criticism continues to evolve, and the discourses it takes are more unconventional and more irreverent across more platforms with stranger schemes of cashing in that also change throughout the years. After all, no one is hiring at newspapers anymore, and we have to be very frank about that. To say that TikTok and irony memes are the future of criticism would be putting the cart before the horse. But to say that we are knee deep within the platform era of criticism, whether we like it or not, that would simply be honest. Often because material reality is that, obviously, barring from a broader structural economic point from Nick Cernicek's platform capitalism, we are living and working in a consolidated internet, and platforms with built-in or external monetization pay far better than traditional media sources and are capable of building alternative institutions completely separate from the old, with sometimes profoundly dark consequences, as alluded to in the earlier presentation with the images of the alt-right, QAnon, things like that. The real question, and the one that I'd like to engage with in the discussion, is whether we are to, or even can, integrate these new structures with our old ones. Should we? Is it worth it? Are we gatekeeping, or if we don't, are we stifling creativity or trying to be too cool if we do? Situated in a particular transitional time in media history, perhaps McMansion Hell was the last project of internet criticism that bent the knee and adapted to the ways of the old while seizing the means of the new. Next time, it very much might be the other way around. That's all for me.
Thank you, Kate. Fantastic. I cede the floor to Irene.
Well, thank you so much for those three very rich and yet still succinct and sort of pithy presentations. And thanks for also sort of keeping with the time limit so that we could have more of a discussion now. We wanted to sort of, engage in some conversation and also throw it open in a few minutes to questions. So the people in the audience, if you have questions, be formulating them, feel free to throw them in the chat. We had a few questions. Well, okay. Maybe I'll pick up, I'll kind of put aside the questions, some of the questions that we had in mind, and sort of pick up where sort of Kate threw down the gauntlet. I think when you were talking about yourself being potentially part of yesterday's generation, I was thinking to myself, I am like in some sort of like ancient generation, because so many of the kind of, this kind of idea of architectural criticism moving to TikTok and irony memes, I have to say makes my head a little bit explode. And so I guess I'm wondering, you ended with the idea of integrating new structures with old ones. And I wanted to find out a little bit more what you meant by that, and also ask the other panelists, because all of you are exploring sort of non-traditional platforms, new platforms, and yet also, working in some traditional ones. So like Cruz and Nathalie, it was kind of funny to see you pick up a book at the end and, kind of show off the physical object. And so what's kind of, what's governing sort of how you choose to operate between the kind of older media, older platforms and newer ones? And Kate, I think you explained, really eloquently some of the tensions between, moving from a blogger to being the architectural critic of the New Republic, and the kinds of, authority and the kind of institution and that medium and platform offer. So there's obviously kind of trade-offs there. But I'm wondering if sort of all of you can reflect a little bit about sort of the choice of medium, and whether you're still trying to do multiple things, or if it's a kind of conscious choice to move from one to the other.
So I want to open by saying that I think that when we say like integrating new platforms or like opening things up to new platforms, this can go one way or the other. I think I really am glad that Cruz and Nathalie are here, because they give a very spectacular way of showing what can happen when like you actually blow the whole thing open and do something just completely different that is like still pulling from so many different things so as to be called a platform. And also Jess, by doing podcasting, also part of like, I guess like the similar like new media generation that I'm from. But podcasts kind of continue while blogs sort of don't, but we're both also on Patreon, and we both have to like interface with the reality that like if Patreon goes down, we will be scrambling and are sort of at the material mercy of like this giant tech corporation. And so I think that these are like, by using existing platforms and creating new ones for emancipatory and solidaristic means is the good way of doing things. The bad way of doing things, I think, is more broadly seen as like the absolutely ridiculous recent adoption, for example, of like NFTs, which are known as cryptocurrency is known to like have a massive carbon footprint compared to alternative sources of media. And it basically seems like a very cynical cashing in, and a very forced by top down by like companies like Meta now and other places to adopt these new infrastructures of financialization that they claim is going to decentralize things and move the web back towards a decentralized way of being, like it was during, for example, like the Web 1.0 era. But in reality, like if Facebook is pushing something, it's not decentralizing anything. And like financialization is the absolute last place the internet should go, in the way that everything is already commodified, from the image to the click, from interaction to even like, I mean, I have now like crowdfunded all my hobbies. I mean, I'm sorry, like my house blog, my cycling blog, it's all, I think now of my life in ways that I can like somehow scrounge together a little bit more money to survive. And that's not great. That's the downside of all of this. So I would really like to hear from everyone else what they think about this as they work on alternative platforms, but that's sort of the broader point that I wanted to make.
Well, I also think that new media is a very seductive term. Like podcasting is radio, and radio is super old. I think the idea is that sometimes because the internet sort of takes over as this like very new shiny thing, we forget that, you know, what we're doing is really importing really old methodologies to like new distribution systems, and then not leveling the same critiques towards the quote unquote like old systems. Like I'm not actually, I have a Patreon, but I'm not supported by it. I make maybe $20 for maybe 3 months. I was making like $20 a month off of Patreon. I'm supported by the financial system of educational institutions, which actually is new technology, right? Like, and that new technology of like financializing education through loan programs that then essentially support the Social Security payout that was created by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, are essentially like the financialization that, you know, pays me, but that looks very legitimate and old, right? But that's actually like a new technology. But we spend a lot of our time sort of, you know, wringing our hands about new forms of exploitation, well, that are, you know, digitized, whereas like the forms of exploitation that we are all continuously participating in are really old. And, you know, I very much grapple with teaching and the way that teaching is financialized, and the fact that as a Black person and a Black woman in the institution, that like my image gets used to like draw more people who look like me into the institution, and then therefore also drawing them into this sort of like debt relationship with their own education. So I think that is, I think that is a way that I think about sort of new technologies, because it's also a way of thinking about power, which I think sometimes we lose track of. And that is actually a way of like staying very much closer to sort of like the material, right? Is to imagine sort of, you know, who is setting the agenda of this conversation in a way, like sometimes like the conversations on new media, or the hand wringing about like new terminology, like Cruz and Nathalie were showing, are just ways to sort of like cast attention away from who is setting the agenda and who is sort of pulling strings of, you know, really dangerous large-scale forms of power.
The conversation is very interesting because I want to go back to the title, you know, the medium is a message, because I feel like both are as important somehow, like the message and the medium. So when we talk about, you know, using platforms that could be seen as more traditional, if we, and again, it was interesting to think about that two thing that historically, as Jess was commenting too, that, you know, podcast also is kind of a continuation of a legacy of the radio and all this. It's also like, I think both are important in a way that what message can we use through this different kind of platform? How can we subvert those different kind of platform? And I'm thinking like, especially when you think of, you know, about institution or certain types of publications, of medium that we used before for just kind of relegating on the very kind of main dominant, let's say, discourses, and how can we bring new ways to deal with those platforms too? I think like the question of playing with those medium for us is very interesting too. And it goes back also to the other part too, is how in some cases also creating new, well, creating again, like that's like an interesting question about how bringing different types of medium can just be very important to expand the idea of a message, because again, like I think like communication is really important in that, and how can we really be critical of the tools we use to try to engage not just in a wider sense of the world with the topics, but also with the people that we can reach, because at the end, I think that's what also is important for us.
And I think like something that we have to make like clear is that we are not architectural critics. We are basically really angry architects, and the context changes the medium too. When we live in China for 7 years, we couldn't rely on the internet in the same way. Most of the websites are blocked, right? So we had to communicate through WeChat. So it was a lot of like live gallery running, anti-profit, anti-capitalist art spaces that we were doing and stuff like that. And then being in the US, right, in universities, in land-grant universities, in private universities, understanding the context of the institution, then it asks a different type of questions related to the media that we are using to like smash the thing back, right? Like, so it's always a kind of like an act of aggression against the bigger institution looming around you, and seeing. So I feel like media in a way is something to communicate, but also it's kind of a weapon too. And I feel like you grab whatever weapon is near you to smash the system. At least that's how we see it, right? And in this case, it could be a book, or it could be a magazine, or it could be a web page that you just took, or a Zoom connection, or whatever, right? So in that way, is as free as the discourse in a particular way. In that way, we are much less defined by the media and more by the constant anger that is kind of fueling all the projects that are saying, this is just like institutions are not really there for you. So how can we, you know, sidestep that whenever possible, right? And engage with that in a way.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial. And also I really appreciate you bringing the Undercommons into it, and this question of like essentially looting institutions. Is the reason that I got into podcasting really was because I've been a part of a lot of sort of research projects where there's some sort of interaction with the community, and at the end of the day, what you give them is this like, you know, 250-page report that they absolutely like cannot use in any way. So what I was interested in doing was having that sort of interview process, but at the same time packaging those sort of like findings or observations from those interviews in a way that could be useful. Like if we're thinking about, you know, new media, BuzzFeed had this way of talking about their work, where they're like, we want people to use our content to talk to each other. So I was thinking that it would be interesting to sort of put forward like a podcast as a way that people can say, hey, you know, I did this small interview, but it's crazy that it connected to this person's experience and this person's experience, and then can use it in things, you know, like classes or workshops or things like that. And it's not asking you to like go through like this really dense, report to get at these sort of core findings that are most useful to you. So that's sort of one way.
It becomes also like a weapon, like giving weapons to people too, right? So they can equip themselves in a way and giving them tools.
Yeah, or also just to, maybe not a weapon so much as a lens, you know what I mean? Because I think that what becomes really difficult is that people get addicted to frameworks of conversation that have essentially been given to them by people who do not have their best interests in mind. You know what I mean? Like the whole question and all of the nonsense that has been spilt about this like idea of wokeness, right, is absolutely a waste of time. But also, if you step away or sort of zoom out a little bit from just the fact that it's such an irritation, the way that it's being responded to, or the way that's being sort of like picked over like a carcass, is that it is eating so much resource from the institution on a fake conversation that has no capacity to generate new knowledge. But what that tells you is that the institution is very easily scammed. And so, just to go back to the Undercommons, you can find ways, if the institution itself is so little concerned with actually generating this capacity to create, knowledge that hopefully will generate, a way for us to survive, if they're not interested in that, then perhaps you can scoop some of that resource out and be able to put it, really operationalize it with people who are interested in that, dynamic of critical survival.
That's the life of crime, right? Where you're stealing from the institution that he talks about, in a way that is you cannot be on the Undercommons, so you're taking from the institution. That makes it really important.
So what I'm hearing here, if I can jump in for a second, I think this is really interesting. I mean, in a way, what you all are talking about is the question of money. I mean, who funds what kind of work, and are there ways to kind of divert that funding? And so, I mean, I think all the discussion about sort of Patreon versus crowdfunding versus taking institutional funding to do like work that maybe the institution wouldn't normally support. I think this is kind of what I'm hearing, is kind of teasing out some of these strategies of kind of wresting resources and misusing them in some way to sort of better ends. But I also want to maybe, and so I'm happy to kind of keep talking about that if you're interested in going further into that. But I also wanted to pick up on something that you just said, Jess, about the sort of audience that you're serving, or that that you imagine is kind of listening to, or the podcasts, or how the podcasts are intervening in the world. So I guess for all of you, when you're writing or blogging or loud reading, who is your audience? Is it like a kind of general audience? Is it this kind of, the myth of democratization, as Kate put it, of the internet, that you're sort of reaching this like broader audience somehow? Is it architecture students? Is it, who are you kind of speaking to? Do you imagine like a particular person listening or reading?
For me personally, it really depends on which platform my website is being accessed on. So for example, like when it's on the native website Tumblr, like it tends to be younger, millennial, Zoomer. There's like a large like LGBTQ population on Tumblr. And then if it's on Facebook, it tends to be like middle-aged white people. And if it's on Twitter, it tends to be whoever follows me on Twitter. So it's like, it really, like, again, like this is what I'm getting at platforms, is that if you look at like the people who subscribe, I don't get like demographic data on that. They have like a username and they pay me. And so like, I actually don't know anything about them, which is like kind of unfortunate. And I understand why, because of obviously like privacy, for privacy purposes. But it makes it kind of a little bit difficult to understand exactly who is reading your work versus who your work is intended to. And I've always like held a very firm and very fierce belief that the project of McMansion Hell and my other work critically, broadly speaking, was to bring the language and the agency of architectural criticism to anyone who wanted to partake into it. Like that means like my mom who watches HGTV and didn't go to college, like high school kids, like anyone really. Who wanted to like, you know what a dormer is. And so like you can say that that is a populist project. You can say that like, you know, that is a, whether that succeeds, like, again, I don't know. But I've always firmly believed that like we should be doing everything in our power to democratize spaces that have been held away from us. And for me personally, like I don't feel at home in academia. I graduated from graduate school in 2018 with a degree I don't use. And I think that like, I don't know, because I come from a certain class background, like academia and other places where like you would meet people and like the first thing they would ask you is like what your parents did and where they went to college. And it was very, my first years as an architecture critic, it was very jarring to have to answer that my parents didn't go to college. And my parents have no connection to the art world. I have no family in the arts. Like I just went viral, got lucky, and am here. And like, can you imagine if it's like that for me, what it must be like for someone whose axis of oppression intersect in any other way? Like, I can't imagine. So for me, like now actually I'm in a position of power for the first time, which is that like I'm now the editor at large for Failed Architecture, which for me as a high schooler was like a very important source that connected me from reading like pop architecture books to like more serious current criticism. And so like I want, as someone who now has like a position of authority or editorial authority in that publication, I really want to make criticism more accessible to like younger writers and writers from much more diverse backgrounds than the one I came from. And so, yeah, I truly believe like in exactly what Cruz and Nathalie said, like if you are given any amount of power, if you're given any tool, you have to use it to smash the system, because the way that things are now are unsustainable and unfair and messed up. And yeah, that's my, I guess, little personal answer.
Well, for me, I know that I can guarantee that the people who will absolutely listen to the show are people who I interviewed and my grandparents. So I have that down, but then what that means is that it really pushes you to, and I want to do this anyway, but it really pushes you to interview as diverse a set of residents as possible, because then through them, if you think in terms of sort of media, or in the way that I'm thinking about media in relational terms, is that people will ask others to like listen to something that they find interesting generally. So if I am interviewing a pretty diverse range of people, that means that the show will kind of noodle its way through a bunch of different sectors. So like in the Paris season, we're interviewing, you know, a hip hop producer from the eastern suburbs, but then we're also interviewing like the economic development officer for Versailles. So, and they actually had a lot in common, strangely, like their opinions, weirdly conservative, you could say. And that way I can kind of have this understanding that like, okay, there is a pretty good shot that like the podcast is going to make its way through like, you know, Eastern Paris hip hop scene. And there's also a chance that the podcast is also going to make its way through the economic development sector of like very extensive, aristocratic, exclusive Western Paris. And what they come away with from the show might be very different, or how they respond to the show might be very different. But I really do want that wide range of things. And then also Spotify and SoundCloud will give you kind of an understanding of like who is listening where. And there are no, Spotify doesn't have any race statistics. I think Nathalie probably is aware of like the weirdness around race statistics in Europe, how they're really difficult to legally collect, but they will tell you who is like what kind of music the people who listen to your show listen to, which is also a way to map back to race in a lot of ways. So you can get a general understanding, and I sort of know that during in certain times, like my audience skews pretty young, but in certain times my audience skews more towards the Reba McClanahan sort of crowd. So that gives some information, or at least some relief, that it's sort of penetrating into very different sort of sectors, which is exciting to me because it's sort of reflective of the cities that we're talking about. Yeah.
This is fantastic. There's so much here. I hesitate to weigh in and redirect, but I wanted to quickly take a moment, firstly, to invite, because of the scale of who's here, that perhaps we could get some questions that would be, if anybody wants to ask a question in person, maybe you could use the raise hand function under the reaction so that we can see who's out there hoping to ask things. We might do a couple together or something. But I also wanted to bring forward a couple things from the chat. The students. Oh, we can stay in the collective format. I think I don't need to be spotlighted here. I wanted to bring forward a couple of the things that I saw flash by in the chat, because in a way I wish we'd titled this the oldness of new media. I think it's super interesting the way that people are sort of drawing links between their practices and a much longer history of media practices. That's fantastic. And it was interesting reading the students, I think, sort of poking at that a little bit. Wei Sheng had a really great comment about speed. Like, is there something about sort of speed and immediacy of these kind of technologies that changes the way we're working? Is it more real time? Is it somehow less real time? Like, what might actually be different about this? Rebecca had a comment on the point of the sort of radio, about how, like, okay, if radio is maybe like appointment listening at a given point in time, like it now operates in the language that we now use for course teaching asynchronously, right? Like, so what does it mean to be experiencing things in the kind of diffuse way that the internet does? Jesus spoke a little bit about access, like internet access, which I think we could point to being a certain digital literacy. Like, what does digital literacy mean for the sorts of platforms that we're talking about? Like, we think like, okay, Facebook is universal. It's like literally the internet in so many companies and countries. And yet, a lot of these sort of forms require a certain kind of digital literacy to access. I do not know how to look at TikToks, for example. And then finally, Juliana, I think, had a really interesting question about like, what is the sort of, what do these media, what do the platform media do to us as sort of makers of media? The sort of the urge to like keep the content going, right? To keep the spice flowing. Like, what are the ways that it kind of produces in us as the sort of on the kind of theorist end rather than the audience end? What are the changes it produces? So I'd love it if anybody wants to sort of pick up on any of those. That would be great, to think about like what's gained, what's lost, what's different. What does it mean to be doing this in real time, or is it not really real time? Are we shouting in the void? How much are we using Twitter versus how much is Twitter using us to become these sort of like actors in this kind of ongoing click driving polemic? Like, where are we within the way that we are produced as subjects by these supposedly new media? And then we welcome hands for anybody that would like to ask an in-person question.
For me personally, just to hop on that last one, as someone who's, like I said, dependent on platforms for their operationality, that it for me creates this paradox where I'm like independent of institutions, but at the same time like dependent on constantly producing content, which feels like a Faustian bargain, to be quite honest, because if you don't produce content for whatever reason, like, you could have a family emergency, you could be ill, you could be mentally ill, then you don't actually get a break if that makes sense. Like, because you have to constantly produce content because people pay you to produce content. And if you don't produce content, then you won't get paid. And so that's really, that really changes the way I interface with content production. And it's part of the reason why I decided to freelance in the first place on the side of that, because even though I make enough money to basically live in my like little apartment with my husband and my dog from McMansion Howell, I needed something that was outside of that to work on and to build something, a broader critical project, and a project that was slower. So for me, working for print media, for example, it's a much slower process, and you're dealing with the actual materiality of working with print, whereas that, like, for example, word counts are extremely defined. And the editorial process is very different than when you're self-editing and you are the mediator, you're the only mediator between you and the publication of your own work. That's very different than when you are working, for example, within the Republic, like a team of fact checkers, a team of editors, a team of typesetters. Like it becomes so much more a collective effort to produce a piece. And it is a piece, a physical thing that you can hold in your hand. Whereas in the content world, it's very alienating and it's very individualized. And there's this implicit need to get on the grind, as the kids say. But so those are very two different ways of thinking and making words. And I don't know if one is better or worse. I think that's actually worth talking about. And I actually really want to ask Cruz and Nathalie that, because they both work in print and in the digital world. Like, how do you guys feel about those two worlds and how different they are? Because for me, like, it's a chance. One is a chance to slow down and really be methodical, and the other one is the constant need to be doing things.
I think so. So there's two things that this goes two ways. Like, one is that I hate capitalism, and the other one, I love books.
So true.
Right. So books for us are not, and I mean, nothing we do really is meant for engaging with a form of payment, even if we need to survive. And that's like the perpetual conundrum, right? So the media is always about, we identify ideologies produced through media, and there's some sort of formats that architecture accepts as an institution, right? And some others that have been born because of technology. We don't know how long they're gonna be here and so on. So what we try to do is engage with all of them as much as we can, and then do the things that we like. So we make books because we like books. There's no reason, pragmatic reason, other than we have many books in the house and we grew up with books and we love the smell and we love the culture of like having a material object that I can share or protect or, learn from or buy again and again because I like it so much, or trying to reach people. I think reaching people through books is really difficult, and the internet allows certain form of engagement that other formats wouldn't allow. Like when we made a manual in PDF, and release it, there's no way that book would have been able to be printed during COVID, and be shared like it was shared, for example. Or if somebody shares a meme, like in a second, and then you see that it's been much more effective of making a form of criticism, right, than anything else will do in that span of time. So I think it's a matter of balance also, like not getting bored and not getting sucked into a media, like saying like, you're a paper architect or you're a sort of a internet critic or something like, you know what I mean? So there's that also rejection of being labeled because of the material you work with in a way, and trying to be as, we love this kind of corny, but we always love this quote by Ludwig Wittgenstein. He says, "The limits of my language means the limits of my world." And I believe that's true, right? If you only can communicate through a format, you are limited by that, right? Like if I will have a fact checker for everything I'm doing, I mean, I hate working with academic journals because of that. They're fact checking everything. It's like, when I say that I hate capitalism, that's a fact as a personal one, right? I don't need to find a bibliography for this, right? And I should be allowed to write this in a way. So I feel like, what's the format that allows us to do that? That's how it works for us.
And it's interesting too, because I think also going back to the question of speed because sometimes, you feel like a certain urgency to have a project communicated, or again, I think for us, it's not just about distribution or something. It's like we always think of every type of project, but we like to think it like very like a start of a conversation. So it's like just a tool of like, how can we bring more people?
Well, it could be a conversation with us.
It could be a conversation with us, but how can it become like, you know, more like into this kind of mutual network, of solidarity or mutual aids, or like how can you bring other people in the discussion too? Because it's also acknowledging like sometimes you have your own limitations, but sometimes you really want to engage in some topics, and thinking of also what can be the media to do that. So thinking of publication too, a lot of publications we did sometimes were just like, you know, self-made. If it's like a lot of time we wanted also just to be like staple, distributed, you know, free, like a zine, right? Sometimes it's like just making posters. Sometimes it can be making murals.
Making propaganda. That's what a lot of what the work we do is basically propaganda, right? Like anti-capitalist propaganda, anti-racist propaganda, or something like that. So what's the effective way, not only to distribute it, but to make it cool in a way so people want to be part of what you're doing? I think that that's also something that gets overlooked. It's not just to do it. It's that if you think that being anti-racist is also what's also aesthetically pleasing, imagine, right? Like you can be doing the work and also do the work that is most amazing too, right? So there is this combination of the media and the format and the intention to also seduce and to be part of like almost commodify the revolution, but not for profit.
So, Irene, I was gonna say, perhaps what we could do, we have some questions lined up. Perhaps we could actually take both questions and then return to conversation, just to be respectful of folks' time and keep it crisp. So perhaps Yasmin, perhaps you could go first, and then Dezan, and then we'll discuss. How's that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a question, but just some thoughts. One of the books that I just moved again, and I'm unpacking all my books, all 30 boxes, and one of the first books was Marshall McLuhan, Mitchell's Reconfigured I, which is now next year will be 30 years old. So just thinking of that just makes my brain explode. But I'm super, first of all, encouraged by what's happening right now in this moment, because first of all, to have two people who now teach at an institution, Iowa State, in one of the whitest, most homogeneous states in the country, and actually bringing to that institution a little bit of the excitement that left with Jennifer Bloomer and Brad Katansky and those guys, and hooray for that, and hooray to you guys for being there. I'm super encouraged by the heterogeneity of this crowd here, by the fact that CCA now has a history theory program. I think is fantastic. And I think the transcript of this is making theory, right? So the transcript of this thing is the seeds of criticism in the future generation of critics. One thing I just want to say is, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I get overwhelmed with everything that's going on. Maybe it's just because I'm older, but I think as what I call myself as an image text sort of scholar, or text image scholar, I think at the end of the day, it does still come down to those two things, right? Images and texts. Now, the images and the texts have become much more diffuse, much more heterogeneous, come from multiple constituencies that didn't exist before. But I think it's good to sort of think about what those two things mean to media, and the fact that we still rely so much on those two players. Right. And Banham always said that for better or for worse, we are driven by images. Architects, we are driven by images. And those of us who write try to put some meaning behind those images. But, you know, I would encourage everyone to sort of think about that constant, and how it's been complicated, right? Text, image, and how have our eyes been reconfigured, 30 years since the reconfigured eye. So bravo to everyone. It's good to see old friends, and congratulations on this fantastic conversation.
Very well said. Dezan.
Hi, everyone. Dezan, one of the MArch students. My question is around like a position of power. And this is a conversation that I'm having with students at CCA a lot. And it relates to what you were talking about with you being like angry architects versus like critical theorists, or however you framed it. Because I'm realizing that students, or at least the students that I'm engaging with, are already angry with the field. And we can see how the field is extremely oppressive, and like how it's perpetuating explorative acts. And because we can see this so clearly, we can see how it's tying into the institution. But as students, we opt into these institutions to either gain credibility or prove our worth so that we can actually engage in the field. And like my question is, what, from your perspective of people who are in the field who also understands the lens that we're seeing the field, what is our position of power? Like, what are the lenses and tools that we have around us that we can equip ourselves with now, so that if we choose to continue to engage with the field, it's not something that we're waiting for later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this Tommy Morrison talks about this when she says that she talks to the students, so one day when they make it, they don't become what they despise. So it's not like to get to power to hoard it, but to break it away and to give it back. And I feel like if we are clear with that, I mean, and to give you optimism, I feel like we are in a really unique moment in time. We have never been so informed about the global planetary states of our disenfranchisement, right? You cannot deny anymore that, oh, I didn't know that this was happening here or there. It's not possible, right? And I feel like that's a real unique opportunity that young generation has, right? I've been in Black Lives Matter protests where the people going in front of the police were mostly white kids, and that was, for me, it was really illuminating. It's like, wow, it's kind of interesting to see, right? So then what do we do to not become those institutions? I feel like, is it possible? Like, what worlds can we imagine, right? And how can we create an environment that is better for the future generations than for us, right? More accessible, it's not so expensive, it's not so how can we still acknowledge how this is a real intersectional problem with class, gender, and so on and so forth, right? So taking that into consideration, right? And being really aware and be ready, right? Because it's not gonna be easy, but be really clear with that, right? Don't let it go just because it's uncomfortable for some people, right? I feel like just keep pushing the pedal to the metal, right? And then let's see where we go, right? I have no idea, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, when I think about institutions, I really think about one is two things. One is the will for survival, right? And the thing that when you, again, understand the framework that you're operating in, the thing that institutions are really good at is having you think at the scale of the institution and think within the institution as like an immutable frame, right? But if you zoom out beyond that, and this is why I bring up the financialization of institutions and sort of like this sort of cycle of debt that is, again, financializing American higher education, is that it's about as sustainable as coal mining, right? Like, are we really going to accept that it costs like $100,000 for 1 year of school? That is unsustainable. So if we understand that that is not going to survive, what is the thing that you can scoop out that can be a bit more permanent? Which gets back to survival, because I think that the will to survive is built off how much you invest in relation, right? So I think many institutions give lip service that, we're bringing this person and we're bringing that person, et cetera, et cetera. But are you really invested in the work? And are you really invested in pushing it further? Do you have the capacity even to push it further? So what ends up happening is that what you take out of the institution, what becomes a form of power, is the way that you're building conversations with other people who have the will to survive, essentially, which means pushing beyond just the idea that the institution is an immutable framework. It means building that relation to say that, like, as soon as I get out of this place, the things that we've been talking about together, the things that we've been working on together have to continue. It's not something that you're pushing for a grade, right? It's something that you're pushing for to be able to find a way to live afterwards, right? And the way that you invest in relation too is something that is very hard to mimic on the internet. So for example, like a very sexy meme or Twitter thread or whatever, what is difficult to do is to become invested in the person who has made that meme, or invested in the person who has made that thread. So it becomes more than just I'm consuming content, and more that I am locked into a relation with this person to continue to push and build these ideas, to continue to push and build new knowledge. And if you can do that, despite the way that the United States tends to mediatize apocalypse, it's like that reliance and reciprocal reliance on relation that creates community means that you don't have to coerce people into solution, right? You've already built the framework with them. You've already spent the time with them. So when you say go, they say okay. When you say go, they say where, right? As opposed to, why should I be invested in you in that way? I've only just, seen a meme from you on Instagram. There is this opportunity that what the institution can do is create that moment of that capacity to spark relation, but then it's on you to continue to invest in that and like grind with other people on your ideas.
I think that's sorry, there was a voice. I don't know where it came from. Did somebody want to jump in? Was that you, Kate?
Yeah, that's me. I think it's different for me because I'm not in academia and I'm no longer on staff anywhere. So the only institutions I have to rely on are the ones that I built myself, which basically I am reliant on the kindness of others and the community that we've built together by doing this project for 6 years, which includes, among other things, a Discord server that's very active, and also things like live streams, social events. So it is something, even though it's mediated, of course, through the filter of this structure of Patreon or of the opting into consuming more content, or however cynically you want to view it. Basically, it's enabled me to have a kind of critical independence because my livelihood is not entirely banked upon being reliant on institutions. And is reliant on a little community that I've built that is very special to me. But at the same time, for me, when I have been a part of institutions, sometimes the question comes up of when it's time to walk away. And that also included academia. And when I left academia, I was not prepared for the enormous amount of information I would lose access to. So for example, academic databases, papers, libraries, spaces of information, spaces of knowledge, connections, and suddenly it's just gone. And so I became reliant on outlaw networks, essentially. So things like Arena, things like Library, Memory of the World, things like Sci-Hub, which are quasi-legal entities that are pursued by the actual profit-making academic journals pretty relentlessly, but your view on them notwithstanding, they keep information free. And so I think that we speak so much often about the democratization of information, and sometimes this comes with a bunch of buzzword horseshit about the decentralized internet or whatever, when it really comes to the things that democratize information and the people who risk their lives, including Aaron Schwartz, who lost his, are the people who are acting diametrically opposed and aggressively anti-capitalist in anti-capitalist spaces of memory, spaces, libraries, collections, and that basically that is a commitment to the pursuit of knowledge that I think without that, I wouldn't be able to do my work because I lost institutional access. And so I think we really have to ask questions, is that in as much as institutions can build people up, like I said, like the New Republic built my reputation up, and now that I am no longer working there, my reputation has once again decreased. We have to ask ourselves, like, can we live at, first of all, the mercy of institutions? And second of all, you know, sometimes, like, for example, when the editorial change happened to the New Republic, it became much more conservative, and anti-capitalist and socialist politics like my own were no longer welcome there. And so that was a huge reason why I left. And I was able to do that because I had built up a community and structure that would support me financially. And so it's very difficult to say, like, on the one hand, you have the hustle and grind of content creation. And on the other hand, like, you also have a critical independence, and reconciling those two is something that is ideologically difficult. And so I think it's important to talk about these things, because as people move through this world where everything is commodified, you will have to make decisions about how much you want your life tied to work. And whether that means being an overworked adjunct professor or like grinding on Patreon, it doesn't matter. You have to ask yourself if those forms of stability are worth it, just from like a survival standpoint. So creating spaces of survival is absolutely important. And being able and supporting each other also, especially like at the infancy of the careers of others, which is like really the kind of place I want to be working at as I sort of age out of being like the young critic and I enter my 30s. So you don't, when you are successful, like, you cannot under any circumstances rip the ladder out and be like, I got mine. That's really the bottom line. So
thank you for that. And I think this is, we're sort of just at the end of our time, but I have to say this has been such an amazing conversation. My mind is kind of blown, and really appreciate that, you know, we sort of asked our three sets of speakers here to kind of talk about their own work, but the fact that we sort of dug in, and that all of you sort of like zoomed out, and that we've been talking about, you know, these questions around power, capital, institutions. How do you sort of subvert and transform and sort of smash institutions? What are the potentials and limits of different kinds of platforms? The fact that we sort of got into, you know, I think some really important territories of institutional critique and critique of the kind of, you know, capitalist structures around these new media platforms. But also I'm grateful that all of you sort of touched on the capacity for creating new communities and cultivating conversations and sort of calling forth different kinds of communities. And also kind of, you know, although I think we all have a kind of shared suspicion of the rhetoric of democratization, the idea that by exploring some of these new media and platforms, there are possibilities for other kinds of voices to sort of, you know, come forth. So I think there's sort of been both a lot of critique, but also really some notes of optimism. And I also really appreciate the kind of multi-generational nature of this conversation as we sort of all move forward into this kind of new world that we're all sort of navigating and figuring out. So really appreciate also just the conversation in the chat from the students, from our panelists. And thank you to James for kind of introducing and setting us up with some really thoughtful framing. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please come back next week for the last lecture of our series.
Thank you.